Imagine this. You're scrolling through old war archives. Thousands of faces. Tired faces. Dead faces. Faces frozen in fear. And then you stop, because something's wrong with this picture. It's 1945. A muddy field somewhere in Eastern Europe. A group of German soldiers. Their uniforms are destroyed, caked in mud, stained with things you don't want to think about. Their faces are hollow, cheekbones sharp enough to cut, eyes sunk so deep they look like skulls wearing skin. These men haven't eaten properly in months, haven't slept properly in longer. They've been living in a nightmare that most of us can't even imagine. And they're smiling. Not just one of them. Look closer. The guy in the middle, full grin, teeth showing. The man next to him, laughing, actually laughing. His head tilted back like he just heard the best joke of his life. These men are prisoners. They've just surrendered to the Soviet Red Army. The same Red Army that's been trying to kill them for 4 years. The same Red Army whose country they invaded, whose cities they burned, whose people they They're standing in a freezing mud with their hands up. Behind them, the Third Reich is collapsing into ash and rubble. In front of them, years of hard labor in Soviet prison camps. Camps from which millions of German soldiers never returned. And they're smiling. Why? That's the question. And today on Battle Bits, we're going to answer it. Not with dates and division numbers. Not with maps and arrows. We're going to step into their boots. Feel what they felt. See what they saw. And by the time we're done, you'll understand that smile. You might even feel it yourself. Because this isn't really a story about war. It's a story about what happens when the war finally stops. I'm glad you're here. Stories like this, the ones that don't make into textbooks, that's what Battle Bits is all about. So if you want more of them, hit subscribe. It tells YouTube that these stories matter. And it tells me that you get it. All right. Let's find out why these men are smiling. First, you need to understand what they survived. The Eastern Front wasn't like the war you've seen in movies. It wasn't D-Day. It wasn't North Africa. It was something else entirely. Something darker. From the very beginning, both sides knew this wasn't a normal war. This was annihilation. Hitler called it a war of ideologies. The Nazis versus Jewish Bolshevism. The Slavs weren't just enemies. They were subhuman, untermenschen, fit only for slavery or extermination. Soviet political officers? Shot on sight. Civilians? Obstacles to be removed. And the Soviets? They knew exactly what they were fighting for. Survival. Pure and simple. German occupation meant death. So they fought with a ferocity that shocked even battle-hardened German veterans. There were no rules on the Eastern Front. No gentlemen's agreements. Prisoners were shot on both sides. Village burned. Cities leveled. It was a war without mercy. And it ground on for 4 years. By January 1945, everyone knew how this was going to end. The generals knew. The soldiers knew. Even the Nazi leadership, in whatever bunkers they were hiding in, knew. The only question left was how many more would die before someone said enough. The Soviet Red Army had become something terrifying. 4 years of brutal warfare had transformed it from the shattered, panicked force of 1941 into the most powerful land army on Earth. Millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, artillery lined up wheel to wheel for kilometers. And they were pushing west. Fast. The German front line? It didn't break. It dissolved. Units were cut off, surrounded, destroyed. The roads west were clogged with soldiers and refugees, all trying to stay ahead of the Soviet advance. The winter of 1945 was brutal. Temperatures dropped to 30 below, 40 below. Fahrenheit. Celsius. At that point, it barely matters. This was the world our smiling prisoners lived in. The final months. The meat grinder. And now you're going to feel what they felt. If you ask any veteran of the Eastern Front what they remember most, many of them won't talk about what they saw. They'll talk about what they heard. You can't understand the noise. Movies can't capture it. Your speakers can't reproduce it. The sound of sustained artillery isn't just loud. It's physical. It presses on your chest. It vibrates in your teeth. It becomes part of you. Imagine standing next to a jet engine. Now imagine 100 of them, scattered across a landscape, some close, some far, all of them screaming at once. Now add the sharp crack of tank cannons, the ripping sound of machine guns, the whistle of falling bombs, the screams. And now imagine it doesn't stop. Not for an hour, not for a day, for weeks. The Soviet artillery barges rolled across the landscape like thunderstorms. Thousands of guns firing in coordinated salvos. The earth shook. The night turned into day. Men learned to sleep through it because their bodies simply shut down. They had no choice. And then one day, it stopped. For the men in our photograph, that moment came when they raised their hands and walked toward the Soviet lines. The guns fell silent, and in that silence, they heard something they had forgotten existed. Their own heartbeat, the wind, the sound of their own breath, the voice of a Soviet soldier speaking words they didn't understand, telling them to keep their hands up and start walking. And in that moment, something inside them broke. Not in a bad way. The tension that had been holding them together, the adrenaline that had kept them fighting, the fear that had kept them moving, it all just released. And what came in its place? Relief. It was over. They were going to live. At least for now. That's the first piece of the puzzle. But it's not the whole picture. Let's talk about the cold. Not the kind of cold where you shiver and pull your jacket tighter. The kind of cold that kills. By early 1945, the German supply system had collapsed. The trains carrying winter clothing, food, ammunition, destroyed by Allied air attacks. The trucks meant to carry supplies the last few miles, out of fuel, abandoned. The soldiers on the front line got nothing. They wore the same uniforms they'd been wearing for months, patched and repatched, stiff with dirt and old sweat. Their boots had holes. Frostbite wasn't a possibility. It was a guarantee. Every single man on that line had it. Blackened toes, numb fingers that couldn't feel a trigger, ears turned white and brittle, ready to snap off. But the cold did more than damage their bodies. It damaged their minds. When your core temperature drops, your body starts shutting down non-essential functions to keep your heart and brain alive. Blood flow to your brain decreases. Thinking becomes slow, foggy. Simple tasks become impossible. The will to do anything except curl up and sleep becomes overwhelming. And sleep, in those temperatures, means death. Men who had survived years of combat, who had faced enemy fire without flinching, who had done things that would haunt them forever. They were defeated by the simple act of staying awake. They would sit down for just a moment, just to rest their legs, and they would never get up again. When our smiling prisoners were captured, many of them could barely walk. Their feet were numb blocks of frozen meat. Their hands were claws, their faces covered in sores. And yet, when the Soviet soldiers gestured for them to start moving toward the rear, they walked. They stumbled. They crawled. They did whatever they had to do to keep moving. Because movement meant warmth. Movement meant survival. Movement meant another day of life. And compared to sitting in a frozen foxhole waiting for a shell to land on your head or the cold to take you in your sleep, a forced march to a Soviet prison camp seemed possible, survivable. That was worth smiling about. Now let's talk about hunger. Not skipping lunch. Not I could use a snack. Real hunger. The kind where your body starts eating itself. By early 1945, the German soldiers' daily ration was a joke. What had once been bread, canned meat, vegetables, coffee, was now a slice of moldy bread. Maybe a thin soup made from whatever could be scavenged. A piece of horse meat if a horse happened to die nearby, and you were quick enough to carve off a portion before it froze solid. The men were constantly hungry. Their bodies were consuming their own muscle tissue for fuel. They lost weight rapidly. 30 pounds, 40 pounds. Their uniforms hung on them like sacks. Their faces became gaunt, cheekbones prominent, eyes sunken. Hunger does something to your mind. It narrows your focus to a single point. Food. You think about it constantly. You dream about it. You talk about it, describing meals you ate years ago in excruciating detail. You become irritable. You lose the ability to think about anything beyond the immediate problem of getting anything to eat. When our smiling prisoners were marched to the rear, the Soviets gave them food. Not much. A piece of black bread, a bowl of thin gruel, maybe some watery tea. But to men who had been starving for months, it was a feast. It was the first reliable meal they had eaten in longer than they could remember. The taste of that bread, the warmth of that soup, it was proof that they were still alive, that someone, even their enemy, was going to feed them. That was worth smiling about. There's another piece to this puzzle, one that's less visible in the photographs, but just as real. The collapse of command. For years, these men had lived under absolute authority. The German military was famous for its discipline. Orders obeyed instantly. Chain of command sacred. Punishment for disobedience severe, up to execution. But by early 1945, that system was cracking. Officers were killed and not replaced. Orders from headquarters arrived late or not at all. The military police, the feared chain dogs who rounded up deserters, became less and less visible as the front disintegrated. And as the system cracked, something strange happened. The men who had been held in its grip for years began to feel something they had almost forgotten. They began to feel like individuals again, like human beings with their own will, their own judgment, their own right to decide whether to live or die. When a German soldier raised his hands to a Soviet soldier, he was doing more than ending his participation in the war. He was formally, finally, irrevocably severing his connection to the German military machine. He was no longer a soldier. He was a prisoner. And while being a prisoner of the Soviets was hardly a good thing, it came with one immense benefit. No one was going to order him to attack a Soviet machine gun nest. No one was going to tell him to hold a position against impossible odds. No one was going to demand that he die for the Führer. The war, for him, was over. The relief of that moment is almost impossible to overstate. Men who had lived for years under constant threat of death suddenly found themselves released from the obligation to continue. They had done their duty, or at least they had done enough. They had survived. That was worth smiling about. Now let's talk about the moment itself. The exact moment captured in those photographs. When a German soldier decided to surrender, there was no formal procedure, no white flag and polite negotiations. It was chaos, terror, a raw transition from combatant to prisoner. Someone would make the decision, maybe an officer, maybe just the guy with the most authority in that particular group at that particular moment. He'd say something like, "It's over. We're done." And he'd raise his hands and start walking. The other men would follow, not because they were ordered to, because they recognized the truth. They were done. The Soviet soldiers who saw them coming would shout, fire warning shots, rush forward to search them, looking for weapons and anything valuable. This was the most dangerous moment. A nervous Soviet soldier with his finger on the trigger. A German prisoner who moved too quickly. A sudden noise. Men died in these moments, even after they surrendered. But if they survived those first few minutes, everything changed. They were marched to the rear, formed into columns, made to walk toward collection points. The distance might be a few kilometers or several dozen. Men who couldn't keep up were sometimes shot. More often, they were just left behind. But even this brutal march had compensations. Every step took them further from the front, further from the artillery, further from machine guns, further from the constant, crushing terror of combat. And as they walked, they began to notice things. The sky was still there. The air didn't smell like cordite and burning vehicles and death. Their hearts were still beating, their lungs still drawing breath. This was the moment captured in the photographs, not the surrender itself, the moment after, when the reality of survival had begun to sink in. They were prisoners, yes. They faced an uncertain future, but they were alive. And compared to the alternative, alive was very, very good. The first destination was a collection point, a temporary holding area a few kilometers behind the front lines, a fenced-off field, a bombed-out factory, an open area surrounded by guards. No medics, no kitchens, no medical facilities. The prisoners sat on the frozen ground, exposed to the weather, waiting for whatever came next. But even here, in these miserable temporary camps, the relief persisted. They were no longer alone. They were surrounded by other Germans, other survivors. They could talk, share stories, confirm they weren't the only ones who had made it out. And they could eat. The Soviets provided food. Not much. A piece of black bread, a bowl of thin soup, maybe a few potatoes. But to men who had been starving, it was a miracle. Imagine not having eaten a proper meal in weeks. Your stomach shrunk, your body consuming itself. And then someone hands you bread. Real bread. Dark, dense, maybe a bit stale. But bread. The taste of it. The feeling of it in your mouth. That was worth smiling about. The screening process at these collection points was basic. The Soviets were looking for SS members, officers, specialists. But for the ordinary German soldier, name, rank, unit. That was it. Then sent back to wait. To eat his bread. To sit in the cold and contemplate the fact that he was still alive. Now here's where this story takes a turn. And it's the part that most people don't know. In the early years of the war, being captured by the Soviets was basically a death sentence. At Stalingrad, 91,000 German soldiers surrendered. Only about 5,000 ever came home. That's a survival rate of 5%. 5. But 1945 was different. 2 out of 3 German prisoners captured in 1945 survived to go home. 66%. Why? First, the war was ending. The Soviet Union wasn't fighting for survival anymore. They could think about longer-term considerations. Second, and this is crucial, the Soviet Union needed labor. The country was devastated. Cities in ruins. Factories destroyed. Millions dead. They needed millions of hands to rebuild. And where was that labor going to come from? Standing right in front of them with their hands up. The German prisoners were a resource. They could be put to work rebuilding what their own army had destroyed. A dead prisoner can't work. A prisoner who dies of starvation before he can be put to work is a waste. So the Soviets had a pragmatic reason to keep prisoners alive. Rations were increased. Slightly, but significantly. Medical care was provided. The most brutal excesses were curtailed. Third, the prisoners themselves were different. They were survivors of years of brutal warfare. They knew how to endure hardship. They knew how to support each other. And fourth, they knew the war was ending. They knew Germany had lost. They knew their captivity wouldn't be forever. That hope, that knowledge that there was a light at the end of the tunnel, was a powerful force. The prisoners at Stalingrad didn't have that. For them, the war was still raging. The outcome uncertain. They had no reason to believe they would ever go home. The prisoners of 1945 could see the end. It was a long tunnel. It would take years, but they could see it. That was worth smiling about. The prisoners were loaded onto trains and sent east, into the interior of the Soviet Union. The vast, mysterious expanse that had swallowed Napoleon's army and was now preparing to swallow them. The camps were located wherever labor was needed. The industrial cities of the Urals, the coal mines of the Donbass, the forests of Siberia, the ruins of Stalingrad itself. When they arrived, They were screened again. Health assessed. Assigned to work brigades based on skills and physical condition. And then put to work. The work was brutal. 10, 12, 14 hours a day. Clearing rubble. Rebuilding factories. Laying railway tracks. Mining coal. Cutting timber. The barracks were overcrowded. Men slept in shifts, sharing bunks, sharing lice. Sanitation was primitive. Disease was rampant. Tuberculosis. Dysentery. Typhus. The food was inadequate for men doing heavy labor. They were constantly hungry, constantly tired, constantly losing weight. But they survived. They formed friendships, alliances. They looked out for each other, shared food when someone was sick, covered for each other when someone was too weak to work. These bonds were essential. A man alone had little chance. A man with friends had a fighting chance. The guards were a mixed bag. Some were cruel. They took pleasure in humiliating and abusing prisoners. Some were corrupt, stealing, demanding bribes. Some were simply indifferent, doing their job without malice, but without compassion. But some showed moments of humanity. A guard who looked the other way when a prisoner took extra bread. A guard who let a sick man rest. A guard who shared a cigarette. These moments were rare, but they were remembered. Prisoners who survived spoke of them decades later. They mattered. The guards were themselves products of the Soviet system. Many were war veterans. They had seen their comrades killed, their homeland devastated. They had every reason to hate the men they guarded. And yet, most of them didn't act on that hatred. They did their duty and let the prisoners live. The months turned into years. 1945 became 1946. 1946 became 1947. The prisoners worked. They survived. Some died, but many more lived. The first large-scale releases began in 1948. The Soviet Union had made progress in reconstruction. International pressure was mounting. The prisoners who were no longer essential were sent home. The journey home was its own ordeal. Trains crowded with released prisoners. Primitive conditions. Scarce food. But no one cared. They were going home. The trains crossed into Germany at designated exchange points. The men were handed over to German authorities. Registered. Examined. Given clean clothes and proper food. Sent onward to their hometowns. But the homecoming was difficult. The men who returned were not the same men who had left. They were thinner, older, marked by their experiences. Their wives had aged. Their children had grown up without them. They were strangers to each other. Some adjusted, found work, rebuilt relationships. Others never did. The scars were too deep. But there's one more group. The document this story is based on mentions them specifically. 10,000 men, held until 1955, 10 years after the war ended. These were men convicted of war crimes by Soviet tribunals. Some convictions were legitimate. Some had done terrible things. But many were questionable. Minimal due process. Flimsy evidence. Confessions extracted through coercion. They were held in strict regime camps. Part of the Gulag proper. Harsher conditions. More dangerous work. Smaller rations. Higher death rates. But some survived, year after year, watching others released while they remained, wondering if they would ever see Germany again. Their release came in 1955. Stalin was dead. The new Soviet leadership wanted better relations with the West. West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer made their return a priority. He traveled to Moscow, negotiated face to face. A deal was struck. In October 1955, trains carrying the last prisoners arrived in West Germany. The men who stepped off were ghosts. Thin, worn, aged beyond their years. A decade in the harshest conditions imaginable. But they were free. Now, let's return to the photograph. We've traveled a long way. Through the final months of the war. The cold, the hunger, the noise, the collapse, the surrender. The camps, the long years, The return. And now, looking at those smiling faces again, we understand. It wasn't a smile of happiness. These men weren't happy. They had lost everything. It wasn't a smile of defiance. They were too exhausted for that. It was a smile of relief. Pure, overwhelming relief. The noise had stopped. The shells had stopped falling. They were still breathing. It was a smile of release. The burden of military discipline had lifted. They were no longer soldiers. The war for them was over. It was a smile of hope. Faint, maybe. Irrational, probably. But hope nonetheless. Hope that they would survive the camps. Hope that someday they would go home. And it was a smile of recognition. Recognition of the sheer absurdity of it all. They had been trying to kill each other for years. Now they were standing in a field with their hands up, looking at a Soviet camera. The war had stripped away everything. Ideology, nation, cause. All that remained was the simple fact of being alive. That's why they smiled. So what do we take from this? First, war is about people, not strategy, not ideology. People, placed in impossible circumstances, forced to make impossible choices. The smiling prisoners remind us that even the worst of it, there are moments of relief, of humanity. Second, the will to live is powerful. These men endured years of combat, months of starvation, years of forced labor, and they survived because they wanted to, because they helped each other, because they found reasons to keep going. Third, history is complicated. The Germans were aggressors. They served a criminal regime. They did terrible things, and they also suffered. Acknowledging their suffering doesn't excuse their crimes. It just recognizes that history is made of human beings, and human beings are complicated. The men in that photograph are gone now. The youngest would be in their late 90s. Their stories, whatever they were, have ended, but the photograph remains. And as long as we look at it, as long as we try to understand that smile, the men in it live on. Not as statistics, not as enemies, as people, each with a unique story, a unique journey through the meat grinder and out the other side. They smile because they were alive. They smiled because the worst was over, at least for that moment. They smiled because, despite everything, they hadn't lost the capacity for joy. May we all be so resilient. This is what we do here at Battle Bits. We find the moments that history books skip over, the human stories buried beneath the dates and casualty figures, because that's where the real history lives, in the small moments, the strange moments, the moments that don't make sense until you look closer. If that's the kind of history you want more of, you know what to do. Hit subscribe. Join this community of people who believe that the past is more than just names and numbers. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. Someone who thinks they know everything about World War II. Show them the smiling prisoners. Ask them why. I bet they won't have an answer. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about these stories. And thank you for being part of Battle Bits. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and never forget the human beings behind the history.